Hi. Um, Thanks for tuning into this talk. It's an hour long. I'll begin with a short 4-minute segment from a 1-hour play that I wrote in 1997, and it's based on my first psychotic episode that happened in 1991 when I was 21. And the name of this play is Van Gogh's Boots, a guided tour through psychosis.
Oh, very. I had a day to kill in Melbourne before catching my train back to Sydney. I felt amazing. I felt so big. I knew that something important was happening. Something important was happening to me. I knew that I was doing something very special. I can't remember this. The ground started to shake. I met a boy who I thought was an angel. We went to a park together. He asked me to sit on his lap. I turned to him. Do you know who you are? Then the ground started to shake. The ground would shake when I was going the wrong way. Then when I turned a corner, the ground would be still. When the ground was still, I knew I was going the right way. Then I was at a library. There was something which I had to find, but I must be very discreet. No one must know what I'm looking for. It's a secret. I'm looking for a book. I'm looking for a book by a lecturer called Neil. I know he's written something secret, something with the answers I need to know. He's my lecturer, but I know he's used a different name. They're watching me. Excuse me, can I help you? No, I'm okay. They're suspicious of me. They know I'm looking for something. I have to leave here. I'm wandering around Melbourne. There's a man. Does he have a bell? Lord, shower return! Saying something about God. I look at him in the eye. He chases after me and gives me something. It's a gift. Lord, shower return! He knows who I am. He knows I'm special. I go up to a policeman just to prove that I'm okay. Just to prove that nobody knows who I am. Nobody knows who I am. I ask where the cinema is. Excuse me, where's the cinema? I go and see mermaids. Wow, I can read the signs. The signs are everywhere. That little goddamn butterfly, that's me. I was meant to see this movie. It's made for me. It's speaking to me in special language. No, I don't understand. It's talking to me. I was on the night train back to Sydney. I could smell myself. An old woman sat behind me across the other aisle. She was a guardian angel. She had been sent to look out for me, make sure I was okay. Felt good to know she was there. I felt protected. I knew what I was doing was important. I knew I was on a mission. Then I realised this is an initiation. I'm doing an initiation test. They're watching me, the higher souls. I grabbed the Gideon's Bible, which I'd stolen from the ferry, began to read Revelations. The construction of its wall was of jasper. And the streets of the city were pure gold, like women glass.
Wicked Women is somehow knows
Foundations
this.
of walls
The Dyke scene.
adorned.
The Dyke scene of Simply somehow knows about this.
Just foundations of jasper.
Jasper's the first stone.
Third
First
stone,
stone in the city. We're creating a new city. It's sapphire. Sapphire's the second stone. I know sapphire. Lisa's sapphire. Sharp. Yeah, what the fuck is going on? I'm in the new city. Sorry, it's shit. And they put temple and it's shit. It shall be no nightmare. There are two stories. It's not just the Bible story. It's a vampire story.
Okay. So my life's been a journey where I've tried to make sense of this episode and two others like it that I had in my 20s. And this journey's led me to the Australian National University, where I'm currently doing a PhD. And the title of my PhD is Consciousness and the Phenomenology of Psychosis. So I try to understand psychosis in a different way to the dominant biomedical model. The biomedical model tries to understand mental disorders in terms of imbalances in neurotransmitters and brain dysfunction, etc. Whereas I look at the ways that consciousness varies to try and see if that can shed light on the sort of experiences people have when psychotic. And I take the first person experience of psychosis seriously. So what we colloquially term madness refers to very profound, I think, and fundamental human experiences. And if we want to understand disorders like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder, then it's important to listen to the experiences of people who have been mad. But beyond this, a rich understanding of humanity requires that we listen to what those who have been mad have to say. So my work involves a survey with 64 participants who've experienced psychosis and 16 one-hour interviews with participants where I ask them about their psychotic experiences. And this talk is based on how the survey and interview material answers my first two research questions in my thesis. My thesis actually has 3 research questions, and I do have results for the third research question, but it's too much material for one talk. As it is, there's a lot of material in this talk, but this is a work in progress, so I haven't finished analysing all my data and I haven't finished writing up the discussion sections for these research questions in my thesis. I'm still working out the arguments, but I was keen to present a talk on this because it's taken a long time to get results, so I was keen to present some results. So I'll begin with some background information to situate my work, and then I'll go into detail with these first 2 research questions. So my work's interdisciplinary. It sits within the framework of several research areas. To begin, it's part of a research area called phenomenological psychopathology. Phenomenology is a term that was first used to describe a research method used by a school of philosophy that included philosophers such as Husserl, but it's now used more broadly to describe the study of the structure of human consciousness. And consciousness means our subjective experience. It includes things like our perceptions, sensations, emotions, etc. And philosophers often say there is something it is like to have these experiences. So there's something it's like to see the red of a rose or to smell the smell of coffee. Psychopathology, it refers to the study of mental disorders. So phenomenological psychopathology tries to understand the first-person experience of mental disorders such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, anxiety, depression, etc. Now, the philosophers who engage with phenomenological psychopathology, they often draw on the continental tradition of philosophy for their understanding of consciousness, such as the work of Husserl, etc. I draw on the science of consciousness literature in the analytic traditions, specifically work by Tim Bain and Jakob Hoovy, etc. So Bain, Hoovy, and Owen argue against the idea that there are levels of consciousness. Clinicians working with brain damaged patients often talk about different ways of being conscious in terms of levels. And what they're basically doing when they speak that way, to simplify it, they're talking about different ways of being conscious in terms of one dimension. And this is more or less this dimension of arousal. So if you're in a coma, you're unconscious. If you're under light anesthetic, you're at a higher level. If you're in the normal waking state, you're at a higher level. If you're on amphetamines, you're at a higher level. But Bain and others suggest that these different ways of being conscious, such as a normal waking state, REM, dreaming, being under light anesthetic, etc., we call these different ways of being conscious global states, and they vary from one another upon in multiple dimensions. I call these dimensions domains of consciousness, and they include the level of arousal, also the number and quality of contents, and they refer to the structure of consciousness, which includes how we experience time, attention, unity in the self, and also the functions of consciousness, which refers to how accessible the contents of consciousness are to various systems in the brain, such as memory, decision-making, behavior, etc. Okay, I'll talk about these domains in a bit more detail in a moment. But firstly, my work also engages with delusion literature. This really refers to my third research question, which I'm not going to discuss in this talk, but I will define psychosis and delusions to distinguish them. So psychosis refers to a disconnection with reality, and it includes experiences that may include hallucinations, delusions, disordered thoughts, etc. And it's a symptom of illnesses such as schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. Delusions refer to unusual beliefs, often false beliefs, such as the belief some people have that they're dead, or that someone close to them has been replaced by an imposter. And people often won't give up these beliefs despite a lot of counter evidence. There are different theories of delusions. Again, I'm hoping my third research question will engage with this, but I still have a lot of work to do in this area, and I'm not going to discuss it further. So I'll just go through what my three research questions are now. So the first one is, how does consciousness differ during psychosis compared to the normal waking state? And the second one is, do the general facts about consciousness during psychosis that we discuss in one mean that psychosis is a distinct global state of consciousness? And the third one is, how are the general facts about consciousness during psychosis that we discuss in one associated with the beliefs people have when psychotic, and vice versa? Okay, so I'll begin with my first research question. So this question was answered by part one of my surveys. The survey was conducted with 64 participants who were over 18 and had all experienced at least one psychotic episode, and they weren't currently in hospital or experiencing significant distress or psychotic symptoms. So we tried to screen out people who are unwell. Part one of the survey contained 53 questions measuring 13 domains of consciousness. I'll discuss those domains in a moment. These questions were on a scale of 1 to 7, from strongly disagree to strongly agree, where 4 was equivalent to the normal waking state. And these are the domains that we measured. So I'll go into arousal in a bit more detail, and then I'll try and go through the others a bit more quickly. But I'll just go through them to give an idea of how these aspects of consciousness can vary in given different situations. So with arousal, I've said clinicians working with brain damage patients, for example, patients in a coma or a vegetative state, often use a taxonomy of consciousness where they talk about these different ways of being conscious in terms of levels. Now, there's no way to objectively measure the level of consciousness in a subject, but clinicians use different measures, for example, the perturbational complexity index, to determine how much brain damage patients have. And this PCI is conducted using electroencephalogram and transcranial magnetic stimulation. So transcranial magnetic stimulation is conducted with the patient. It sends an echo across the brain, and this shows how interconnected brain areas are in terms of how they're communicating with each other. So, for example, in an unconscious patient, that echo will die away quickly. And so this echo, an algorithm works out the PCI, and that determines how much brain damage a patient has in terms of this interconnection of brain areas. Another scale that neurosurgeons use is the Glasgow Coma Scale, and this really reports how responsive patients are in terms of verbal commands, motor commands, and how they're able to move their eyes, etc. When it came to arousal, I asked 4 questions in the survey to try and test for arousal, 2 for greater arousal and 2 for less arousal. And these questions were, during my last psychotic episode, I was more awake than normal, I was more alert than normal, my mind worked more slowly than normal, and I was less alert than normal. So for each of these domains, I've asked 4 to 6 questions to try and determine how participants experience them. And those 53 questions were randomly generated in each survey. So I'll try and go through the others a bit more quickly. Number of contents is like the bandwidth. So it's normally considered we can just have a certain amount of information in working memory at a given time. Like in the normal waking state, that's about 4 chunks of information, but can perhaps expand on LSD and be less under light anesthetic. The next 3 refer to the quality of contents. Again, contents are things that we perceive and sense, etc. And intensity, if you hear a bird outside, it's less intense than a car roaring past blaring music. With complexity, a single note of a piano is going to be less complex than all the sound in a nightclub. And with determinancy, a rose at the center of your visual field is going to be more determinant than on the edges where it becomes degraded. With spread of attention in the normal waking state, we can often have things in the center of our attention, but it's argued that on a drug like ketamine, your attention can be spread more broadly across the contents of consciousness. With control of attention on a drug like ketamine or having an epileptic seizure, it's difficult to control attention, whereas in the normal waking state, we normally can. With time, in the normal waking state, we normally experience what's called the specious presence. So time seems like to extend for a few seconds, but that can speed up if you're engrossed in something, slow down if you're bored, or seem to stand still on LSD. I check for 2 dimensions of time. I check whether the speed seems different, faster or slower, or whether time just in general doesn't seem like it is in the normal waking state. I also check for how the experience of the self, if that seems normal or not. And again, these last 3 are to do with function, so which is the access of contents to systems in the brain, and I look at memory, decision-making, and behavior. Okay, so they're the 13 domains. When I mention the 13 domains, this is what I'm referring to that we measure. Okay, so this is what the survey looked like. So you ask a question, people answer from strongly disagree to strongly agree, and neither agree nor disagree is equivalent to the normal waking state. And the way we did this, I had a lot of help with the statistics, which I'm grateful for. We used a principal component analysis with SPSS software, which is a statistical software package. And principal component analysis is really a fancy way of getting the average. So you have 64 people answering 4 questions on arousal. You work out the average, and then you want to say the average for in psychosis for arousal is 5.19, whereas the average in the normal waking state is 4. Then we want to know if there's a statistically significant difference between those numbers, or whether they're due to chance or not. And that's what a t-test does. So we ran t-tests to find out if there were differences in those experiences of those domains during psychosis compared to the normal waking state. And then the next slide is the answer to that. So the results, and 10 out of 13 of those domains were statistically different during psychosis compared to the normal waking state. And these include arousal, number and quality of contents. Spread of attention didn't seem different, but the control of attention was. The speed of time wasn't different, but time nevertheless did seem different. The experience of the self was different. Memory wasn't different, but decision-making and behavior were different. Okay, so to answer this first research question, how does consciousness differ during psychosis to that of the normal waking state? You have an alternative hypothesis, which is that the average scores for these 13 domains are not going to equal 4. And the answer is that consciousness differs during psychosis to the normal waking state along 10 out of 13 of these domains. Okay, so that is the answer from the survey results that answer the first research question. But recall, I said I also conducted 16 one-hour Zoom interviews. These interviews were open-ended, but I did try and ask a couple of targeted questions. For example, did reality seem different when you're psychotic, and did it seem different because perception and sensation were heightened? I haven't finished analysing my interviews yet, but I'll read a few quotes now to give an idea of how experiences differed during psychosis. So when asking whether reality seemed different, participant 4 said, I definitely knew it wasn't the normal reality that everyone else was living in, but when the ideas were coming, it felt like it was a revelation. That sense of things are starting to make sense and all this information is coming. Participant 5 said, it's like the inner world is bigger than the outside world. It's like you've gone within, you've gone somewhere else. Participant 5 said, as well as reality seeming different, that wasn't just a psychosis, it was also the effect of treatment. They said, some of what I experienced was purely because I was in seclusion. I was in a locked ward. So when there's questions about time or familiarity or consciousness, that connection with things that are in the here and now, the context of when you're in a locked ward for 2 weeks has to be considered. A psychiatrist looks at you in the locked ward and says, yes, that's psychosis. But for me, some of what you're asking about was actually the effects of treatment. If they're heavily sedating you, when I was answering your questions, some of that was because of heavy sedation. Some participants claimed that they didn't realize they were in a different reality. For example, participant 2 said, I slid into this world. Everything is suddenly focused on me. And it probably is that Truman Show idea, that overarching thing that's controlling everything in your life. So it wasn't exactly my thoughts. It was more that external influence trying to control my thoughts. There wasn't a line in the sand where I could think this isn't normal. I just slid into it thinking, oh, this is the new normal. And participant 3 suggested reality was normal, except it was more profound and eventful. They said, it was the everyday for me, well, more profound and eventful. I could be alone in my flat for long periods of time and feel like I was in company because I'd be listening to the radio and the people on the radio were watching me through these cameras, and what they were saying on the radio was a direct response to what I was doing in my flat or thinking because I was watching the show and commenting on it. So with that whole profound and eventful thing, what I meant was there was a sense of never being alone, that there was always something going on, when in reality I was just sitting in my flat listening to the radio for the better part of the day, alone. Again, I asked participants if reality seemed different because perception and sensation were heightened. Participant 1 agreed. They said, certainly some of the things that I'm aware of as my mood starts to escalate is that a lot of my senses become a lot more heightened. I exist in a state of heightened sensory perception anyway. I'm very sensitive to sound and to light and to touch in particular. And as my mood goes up, that will shift from just being hypersensitive to these things to starting to perceive things that aren't there. But participant 2 denied perception was heightened. They highlighted manic thoughts and mood. They said, when you say heightened perceptions, I wouldn't say it was like a drug experience. I'd say I was manic, more manic, and I was definitely moodier, but I don't think I recognize it as being, oh, wow, I can see things clearer. I didn't have any of that sort of thinking. And finally, this is the last quote for now. I'll read some more later in the talk, but participant 4 agreed that sensation was heightened, and they highlighted motivation. They said, I think everything's heightened. It just depends exactly what's going on. I think it's also motivation. I feel a lot more when I'm in a heightened mood. I'm so much more motivated to do things, and it's because I feel the sensation so much more. In terms of feeling the music when I'm dancing, I feel connected to the music. There's something about being really, really in sync with it. It just feels like you're really binded to the thing because it's not just your ears that are listening, every bit of you is listening. So this is just a small selection of quotes. As I said, I haven't finished analysing the interviews yet, but it just gives an example of how these dimensions can be experienced differently. And I'll return to this later in the talk when I'll read some more quotes. But for now, I'll move on to my second research question. So that really sets the stage, that first research question, in terms of what these domains are and how they differ in psychosis. But I guess the focus of my work is really on this question of global state. So the second research question is, do the general facts about consciousness during psychosis discussed in question 1 mean that psychosis is a distinct global state of consciousness? Now, when a creature is conscious, it must be conscious in a specific way. For example, the normal waking state, REM dreaming, states of being under light anesthetic, or states of being on LSD. And a global state is a specific way of being conscious, and it consists of a natural grouping of domains of consciousness that don't vary greatly across instances of the global state and that are distinct from other global states. So the idea here is that we have a domain like arousal, and that can be experienced in different ways. For example, low arousal under light anesthetic and high arousal on amphetamines. So we should be able to rate these domains on a scale, and that's what we've just done in part 1. We've taken these 13 domains and we've rated them from 1 to 7. Okay, so the assumption with global states is that when these domains their ratings change in some predictable way, then a creature is going to move from one global state to another. So these global states are distinguished from each other based on how these domains, such as the 13 we measured, are experienced. Now, to answer this research question, it helps to have a definition of a global state. This is a definition that my supervisor, Daniel, helped me with. But if you want to know if two subjects, X and Y, or two people, Sue and Bob, are in the same global state, we have X is in the same global state as Y at a given time, if and only if X and Y are in a subclass of all conscious subjects at that time, such that, and we have two conditions here, every member of that subclass has a similar rating regarding A, B, C, and these are the various domains that are relevant to a global state, and this subclass is a natural class. So what this means is we have all the conscious creatures at a given time, and if Sue and Bob are in the same global state, they're in a subclass of all these conscious creatures. And Sue and Bob have similar ratings regarding these various domains of consciousness, and this subclass or global state is a natural class. And we stipulate that because we want to be able to make generalizations from about different instances of that subclass. Saying it's a natural class is also like saying it's a natural kind, and I'll return to this conversation in a moment. Okay. But first, I'll keep going with this research. So here's a wonderfully AI-generated image of what I imagine these global states look like. So here's psychosis in the normal waking state. Of course, global states don't just sort of float randomly in space. They're manifest in creatures who experience them. But the idea is that we have this multi-dimensional space, and a global state is going to be somehow situated in that space, depending on how these domains are experienced. And so the idea for this research question is to take one of these, say the one at the front, the sphere at the front, and let's say that represents our sample of 64 participants who've experienced psychosis and the average score for those domains of consciousness. And what we're doing with this research question is we're questioning the assumption that members of this global state will have, or if it's a global state, will have similar ratings regarding these domains. So we've said with a global state, if Sue and Bob are in the same global state, they'll have similar ratings regarding the various domains of consciousness. So if psychosis is a distinct global state, and Sue and Bob have experienced psychosis, they're going to have similar ratings regarding these domains of consciousness. And that's what we're questioning. But that it doesn't, my survey results and my interviews both suggest that that's not quite right, that they have similar ratings. So I have different results for the surveys and the interviews, and I have slightly different arguments for them. I'm still working on my arguments, but what I'll do now is I'll report the results from the survey, and then I'll have a discussion where I'll discuss what that could mean. And then I'll read some more quotes from my interviews, and I'll revisit this definition of a global state. Okay, so we'll start with the survey. The hypothesis or alternative hypothesis for this research question is basically that during psychosis, different instances are going to differ regarding the average scores for these 13 domains. Okay. Now this image here was produced by that software package I mentioned, SPSS, using a procedure called hierarchical cluster analysis. And what this does, it takes our sample of 64 participants and it more or less divides them based upon the average scores for those 13 domains. And what this has resulted in is 3 predominant clusters. So those 3 vertical lines are each leading to a cluster of participants. So that all the participants are along the bottom there. Now, I've named this. This is another image. It gives a better idea of that. So your outer sphere is your 64 participants, but you have these 3 distinct clusters depending on how those domains are experienced. And I've named those clusters based on the sort of scores for those 13 domains. So the participants in the normative cluster scored most closely to the normal waking state along the majority of those domains of consciousness. The participants in the high arousal cluster scored highest for arousal, and the participants in the low function cluster scored lowest for memory, decision-making behavior, lower than the normal waking state and lower than the other 2 clusters. Now, we can also see how these 3 clusters differ to each other regarding demographic information, such as gender, age, education, etc., diagnoses, and the beliefs that people had during psychosis. And I'm not going to go into this in this talk, but the second part of my survey contained 20 questions from a questionnaire that asked participants about the sort of beliefs or delusions they had during psychosis. So I do have results that show how the people in the participants in the different cluster, what sort of beliefs they had during psychosis. But I'm still analysing and making sense of those results. But to give you an idea of this shows results for the diagnoses. So here we have the 4 most prevalent diagnoses in my sample. That's schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, and depression. Now, the yellow column here represents the high arousal cluster. So the high arousal cluster is highest for schizoaffective disorder and second highest for bipolar. And these are both mood disorders that involve mania. So you sort of expect the high arousal cluster to score high. But as you can see on the right-hand side is depression, where the high arousal cluster scores lowest, and you'd sort of expect that. It also scored lowest on the left-hand side in schizophrenia, which is interesting. So I'm still making sense of all this data and these results, but this gives you an idea of how you can look at the results and see if you can see patterns that illuminate things. Okay. So now for the next 5 minutes or longer, I'm going to have a discussion about what all of this might mean. I just want to be clear, this is a work in progress. I haven't written my discussion sections in my thesis yet for these chapters, and I still need to do a lot of research to do that. So I'm still working out my arguments, but this is sort of developed for this talk, but it's where my thinking, it's thoughts I'm developing at the moment. So I'll begin by saying my work is questioning this idea of or concept of a global state. And I'm doing that by using the example of psychosis and saying, you know, does psychosis fit this sort of description of what a global state is? Okay, but to understand this work, it helps to understand what natural kinds are and the relevance they have to this work. So a natural kind, it's when scientists go into the world and they carve up the world into distinct categories of categories that exist in nature, and these categories are natural kinds. For example, copper is a natural kind, and knowing that one instance of copper will conduct electricity will allow you to infer that others will. So natural kinds allow us to make inductive inferences and to understand scientific laws. Now, there are different types of natural kinds like essentialism, homeostatic property, clusters, etc. I'm not going to get into that in this talk, but I'll just say natural kinds are relevant to psychiatry. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is the manual that a lot of clinicians use to understand mental disorders, is really a system of categorization that tries to understand mental disorders in terms of natural kinds. And this is significant because if a mental disorder is a natural kind, then we can make inferences from one case to another, which means that treatment that works in one case will work in others. Right. Now, my work works within a different theoretical framework than the DSM. I'm trying to find how these domains of consciousness cluster together in distinct cases of psychosis to see what that tells us about psychosis. And I use a phenomenological approach, as I said, where I use the first-person experience of people who have had psychosis. I use that as my data. Okay. Now, natural kinds are meant to be mind independent. So we would think that global states are not natural kinds because they involve consciousness. But Richard Samuels has written a paper arguing that delusions are natural kinds. And he says that delusions are mind independent in the sense that they exist independently of where we draw the boundaries for them to distinguish them from each other. So using that sort of an argument for the time being, we'll just we might take it that global states are natural kinds as well. Okay. Now I'm going to discuss Samuel's argument a bit because I want to see if it can be applied to my work. But with delusions, we have these subclasses of delusions, such as Capgras delusion, where someone may believe that someone close to them has been replaced by an imposter, and delusions of persecution or persecutory delusions. And it seems that these different subclasses of delusions are the result of different causal mechanisms in the brain. And because these subclasses have different causal mechanisms, it looks like this overall class of delusions is not a natural kind. But Samuels argues that in science we have these different levels of explanation. So quarks belong to the level of fundamental physics, whereas species belong to the level of biology. And we apply that to the brain as well. We have a neurobiological level of explanation, and we also have a cognitive level, for example. And Samuel suggests that because we have these subclasses of delusions, this overall class of delusion is not a neurobiological natural kind, but it's best understood as a cognitive natural kind. So it's best understood on a computational or a functional level, whereas these subclasses of delusions are perhaps best understood on a neurobiological level, neurobiological natural kinds. Okay, so I'm unsure if this can apply to my work. So I'm saying, you know, we have global states and their natural kinds. Is psychosis a global state? Is it a natural kind? But I have this sample of participants which breaks into these three subclusters. And I'm not sure whether I can say these subclusters have different causal mechanisms, but, you know, one argument that may apply, we might be able to say there are these different experiences of psychosis that are realized by different neural states and processes, perhaps, in which case this overall class of psychosis is best understood on a cognitive level or as a cognitive natural kind, whereas distinct subclasses of psychosis or experiences of psychosis are best understood on a more neurobiological level. Again, that's a work in progress. I'm not sure how well that works, but it's an idea. Samuels also distinguishes between generic natural kinds and more specific natural kinds. So we have all the metals are a generic natural kind, but magnesium is sort of a subordinate kind within that. And this may apply to psychiatric kinds as well, where you have psychosis as this generic natural kind, but these sort of clusters or distinct experiences as being subordinate kinds within that. Now I'm going to continue with this discussion, but use a different framework for it. So global states have also sort of been posited as this mid-level explanatory category. And a way to understand that is with the example of species. So we have all the animals in the world, and then biologists come along and they posit these mid-level explanatory categories, and they try and carve up this space into distinct species. So species are arguably the fundamental unit of biology. But there's a huge amount of disagreement amongst biologists about how to carve up this space. And this is partly an empirical problem. It's hard to know the number and boundaries of species, but it's also a conceptual problem in that, like, there's at least 24 different ways to define the concept of species. For example, animals with reproductive isolation or who share a distinct ecological niche, or animals who share morphological similarities or whatever. And these different definitions of species suit biologists who have different goals. So it's very hard to carve up this space. And my work suggests something similar with global states, or if I'm using psychosis as a distinct global state, it's difficult to know how to carve up this space, because I have a sample of 64 that break down into these three subgroups, and it's difficult to know which level is explanatorily privileged when it comes to understanding this experience of consciousness. But I've suggested using an argument like Samuel's, where we have these different levels representing different levels of explanation. Okay. So that's the discussion. I think we might leave that for that. But we'll return to the quotes, because the quotes are such sort of rich data in terms of illustrating all this. So as I said, I haven't finished analyzing all the interviews yet. But what I'll do now is I'll mention a few of the domains that I measured, and I'll give a few quotes that show how participants can have quite diverse experiences of these domains, sometimes opposite experiences of these domains. So I'll start with arousal. Participant 1 seemed to experience low arousal, and they said, "I can sit for hours and stare. It really feels like my head is full of glue and all the cogs have ground to a very sticky halt. And I think that's probably what makes what I now recognize as the delusional thinking so much more vivid, because there's not a lot of other thinking going on." And this contrasts to participant 2, who said, "I was definitely a bit more manic than I usually am, and I had a lot of problems with racing thought, so I'd think a lot about things, but my thinking was hindered. I'd be thinking about paranoia and the conspiracies more than normally. So I was probably heightenedly focused, but I'd be focused on really weird things like the birds having microtransmitters on them." Now I'll discuss time. So we looked at time, and participant 5 said things sped up. They said, "So there's stuff that you feel, think, see, hear, sense that other people don't. I have an awareness of that. I think it's an experience where things have sped up and you can't slow down, like a hyperdrive type of thing. It's like your body. I might be lying in bed and I can't go to sleep, and my feet feel like they're on fire. I found if I responded to that and went for long walks, that my mind would settle." Participant 6 stated that time seemed endless. They said, "And about my perception being heightened, definitely I was on full alert, and perceiving it feels like time in seconds. It was endless. I was in the moment, and the moment never ended until I came out of psychosis." Participant 7 said that time slowed down. They said, "So things will slow down around the threat, and you'll become hyper-focused on the threat, and things will drop away that are not essential to that threat. I would say hyper-vigilant on the threat. Certainly in my first episode, I was completely incapable of doing anything. I couldn't walk. I couldn't think." Now I'll discuss the self. So participant 5 said they seemed quite childlike. They said, "It's a feeling that I can't keep up, like the inner world is bigger than the outside world." And I said, "But you haven't changed. The sense of you as a person, you're still the same person." And they said, "I am, but I'm probably younger. It's earlier life stuff." So like their memories from the past. My husband said, when I'm in these states, it's really painful and awful, but I'm also very funny and childlike. And that's different to participant 6, who seemed to lose their sense of self. They said, "I didn't know who I was. I just knew that I didn't know where I was. I didn't know the time. I just always thought it was daylight because they were outside. I thought I was in the bush, and I was just focused on escaping so they couldn't bury me alive. I knew I was me. I described myself to me as me, but I didn't know my name, and I didn't know anything about me." Okay. They're an example of a few of the domains that I measured and how they're experienced in diverse ways amongst the participants. I'm just going to read 2 more quotes now that have to do with something I didn't measure. So in the interviews, a lot of aspects of or ways of experiencing things come up that aren't included in the domains I measured, and they may be really relevant to understanding psychosis. So I'll give the example of pressure. Participant 2 said, I was trying to get to the bottom of what was going on, and I was agitated, and I was a bit paranoid, and I was confused. It was like trying to find out what's going on and trying to process all that, because it was a lot of pressure thinking that everything's after you all the time for that whole time. It was a lot of stress. And participant 8 said, I experience it as just overwhelming pressure, and it's a kind of pressure that just breaks you. It's just awful and unrelenting, and it's very hard to communicate it to anyone who hasn't experienced it. And I felt it across every area of my life. Okay, so yes, so those quotes reflect how participants experience these domains and everything. So I think we'll revisit our definition here. And you see, condition A here is that every member in a global state has a similar rating regarding these domains. And I've shown in the survey, in the quotes, that that's not the case. But I'll just mention some limitations with the idea of these domains as well. When it comes to understanding what a global state is, we don't know what the relevant domains are. So I took some domains out of the literature, but some of those may not be very relevant, and there are most definitely some that I didn't measure that are relevant to understanding global states. And this definitely applies to something like psychosis. We don't know what's relevant in understanding psychosis. And I've mentioned psychosis includes hallucinations, delusions, disordered thoughts. And so we really need to factor in things like these delusions to understand psychosis. And I've tried maybe to do that in my third research question, where I have some results showing how these 20 questions which reflect beliefs people had during psychosis are associated with these 13 domains of consciousness and vice versa. I still have to make sense of all those results. I don't know if I shed light on this, but anyway, we don't really know what's relevant in understanding global states, as I said. But another point about domains is we can ask what domains have the greatest explanatory power when it comes to understanding global states. And this has to do with the rating, which is the same as the weighting. So in part 1, we took those 13 domains, we measured them from 1 to 7, where 4 was in the normal waking state. And let's say we had in psychosis, arousal scored 5.19 and complexity of contents scored 5.11. So arousal is 0.08 more weighty than complexity of contents when it comes to determining why psychosis is distinct from the normal waking state. So we assume that, when a domain, the further away from 4 it is, the more weighty it's going to be in explaining the difference between psychosis and the normal waking state, potentially. As well, there are amendments we could possibly make to definition 1. I think the interconnectedness of domains is really important. For example, if a creature goes from one global state to another and arousal changes quite a lot, how correlated is arousal to changes in these other domains? And I do have a table where I have my 3 clusters and all the average scores for the 13 domains. And if I look at that carefully, maybe I can see correlations. I haven't done that yet, but whether I can see it in my data or not, I'm not sure. But I think the interconnectedness of domains is important. And I'll just add that there can be added conditions that we don't know. And in relation to this, I spoke to Tim Bain recently, and I draw a lot on, mainly on Tim's work about global states. And he mentioned this background feeling that different global states have, and it's like a mood, and like in depression, it's like this worthlessness, or they talk about this prodromal state in the lead up to schizophrenia, where the reality seems unusual or weird. And it's kind of this background state or mood and he said it gets its tentacles into everything. And I don't know if we can kind of think of that as a structure of consciousness has this feeling in it that is distinct in these different global states. And I haven't accounted for that in my work. I've, very literally taken these domains, tried to rate them on a scale. And I think that's a really valid project. And I think there's room for more empirical work like that to understand global states. But we do need to take this background mood very seriously as well. And as I said, I haven't factored that into my work. Okay, so I might move on now to my conclusion for the next few slides and the significance of this work. I've shown that in my work that consciousness differs during psychosis to the normal waking state along 10 of those 13 domains measured. We don't know the causal mechanisms for schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. So this is sort of a novel approach to psychosis that relies on first-person experience and the science of consciousness. So it's may suggest new directions for research and could have implications for treatment. So that's one thing. But also recent developments in the science of consciousness have suggested this multidimensional approach to consciousness in terms of global states. And while there's more work has been done in sort of understanding how these domains differ in these various global states, there's still not a lot of empirical work done. And yet this is really vital for understanding consciousness, and it has widespread clinical implications. For example, understanding brain damage patients, understanding the treatment and experience of depression, and in the present work, understanding psychosis. But I have shown that positing global states as this mid-level explanatory category may be problematic, because I've used this experience of psychosis and shown that it can be broken down into these kind of clusters, 3 clusters within my sample, and suggested that we don't know which level of explanation is privileged. But I've also suggested using an argument like Samuel's to say these different levels reflect different explanatory levels. So psychosis can reflect a more kind of cognitive natural kind, whereas subgroups within that may reflect more neurobiological kinds. Anyway, that's a work in progress. But having said that, if psychosis were a distinct global state, according to our definition, subjects who experience psychosis would have similar ratings regarding those domains. And this is not the case according to the survey or the interviews. So, it looks like psychosis is not a distinct global state. But these findings may generalize to other experiences that we think of global states, like REM dreaming and the normal waking state. And it could be that the concept of a global state is not very helpful in the emerging science of consciousness, or just that we need to think more carefully about how we're defining it, and that it needs revision. I had a lot of help with the stats. I'd like to thank everyone who helped me, and thank you. I don't know how to turn this off now. Oh, here we go. How about I stop sharing and I find, well, I'll just end it. Thank you for listening. Bye.